My name is Joan Bristol. I'm an associate professor of Latin American history at George Mason University. My research focuses primarily on 17th century Mexico, and my teaching area is colonial Latin America. Oops. And of course, Latin America is this region here. It's the region of the Americas that was colonized primarily by Spain and Portugal, beginning in the 16th century. Sometimes French America is also defined as Latin America or included in Latin America, particularly the French Caribbean. So in other words, this field is defined Eurocentrically. It's defined by colonialism, although we try to decenter Europe. And you'll see in my talk today, this is what I'm trying to do. And of course, different parts of what we call Latin America develop differently. So in many ways, this is a kind of artificial but highly useful category, right? Like all of the categories that we work with. On a related note, when I refer to America, I'm not referring to the United States of America. Of course, the US is part of America, but this whole region is this whole region is America, right? So calling the US America is inaccurate and totally ignores like a whole region of the world. So that is the reason for the parentheses in my title. I'm talking about American history, and I'm focusing on this huge region of America that we call Latin America. As you see in my title, in this talk, I will focus on how chocolate, tobacco, and other Latin American technologies shaped early modern Europe, and I will talk later about what I mean by technology. I was asked to talk about Latin American connections to the Renaissance. And Latin America had a very important global role in the early modern period and influenced early modern Europe in profound ways. We don't tend to talk about the Renaissance really in my field because it's really a European event, I guess, or category. But the changes and developments of the Renaissance are definitely part of the story of European colonization in Latin America. And as I will explore, Latin American people, cultures, goods, and technologies had huge effects on Europe and the rest of the world. So first, I'm going to talk generally about different ways of looking at the role of this region we call Latin America in the globalizing world of the early modern period. And then I will focus specifically on the trade in Latin American commodities as a way of focusing our thinking about these global connections. So I'm sure you're very familiar with this image and this idea, right? I mean, you probably use it in your own teaching. And I'm putting it here just so that we can remember the goods and other items that moved across the Atlantic. Okay, so first, how can we think generally about Latin America in the early modern period and the connections between the Americas and the rest of the world? Well, there are a number of ways of doing that, and I'm going to talk about 3 ways of doing that. Okay, so first, if we want to think about connections, we can think about the economic role of Latin America. As we all know, Europeans encountered the Americas while looking for a route to the center of the old world economy. For centuries before 1492, the center of global trade and wealth and culture had been this region centered on the Indian Ocean and the Middle East. So merchants in these regions traded spices, porcelains, textiles, and all kinds of things that signified sophistication and wealth to Europeans. And I apologize, there's a misspelling on this slide, but I like it because I like the slide just because it lists the goods. So again, merchants were trading all these things that to Europeans seemed like sophistication and wealth and culture. And Europeans wanted a direct route to this important region so they could get this stuff, right, and have access to this sophisticated culture. The Portuguese, during the 15th century, slowly mapped their own route around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. Again, over the course of the 15th century, it was a long process. And in 1492, the Spanish monarchs sponsored the first of Columbus's 4 voyages because they too were hoping for an alternate route to this region. They also sponsored him because they hoped to find wealth along the way. And just as a super side note, I just want to say, they were somewhat reluctant to sponsor him, but it was not because he thought the world was round and nobody else did, right? So these are maps from before 1492 that indicate quite clearly that people in the old world knew that the world was round. So they were hesitant to sponsor him because his calculations were wrong, and like they really were wrong, right? But they knew the world was round, so that was not this sort of paradigm shifting idea that Columbus had. Okay, so we all know what happened with Columbus's voyages. He did not find a new route to Asia because his calculations were wrong, although he always believed he had and claimed that he had. Instead, he encountered the Americas. The Spanish monarchs did find wealth in the Americas in many forms, including mineral wealth. And here we have the famed Mountain of Silver in Potosi, modern-day Bolivia. Between 1550 and 1650, Potosi produced about half of Spanish America's silver. So there's a huge amount of silver that was coming from this region in the Andes. This image, the Virgin of Potosi, in which the Virgin Mary is represented as part of the mountain of Potosi, illustrates the importance of this silver-producing mountain for Spaniards. Just as a sort of side note, mercury mines in the Andes were also incredibly important to silver production. So miners needed mercury in order to process the silver ore. And so mercury from mines in the Andes were used in silver mines in the Andes, and mercury was also used in, it was also exported to Mexico and used in mines there. Super dangerous to work with mercury. So the forced laborers who worked in silver mines and also in mercury mines suffered a great deal because of their exposure to mercury. The Spanish and Portuguese and other colonizing nations also found wealth in the form of agricultural products like sugar. Sugar was an old world product that found perfect growing conditions in the Americas and other kinds of conditions. I'll talk about that in a moment. They also found wealth in the form of dyes. You read about cochineal, indigo, pearls, also emeralds, copper, all kinds of goods. And I'm going to go back and talk more specifically about commodities in a little bit. All of these goods were, of course, produced by indigenous and African laborers. African laborers were usually enslaved. Indigenous laborers in Spanish and Portuguese America were also enslaved or forced to labor through other means. There were also wage laborers of all races working in mines and plantations and also urban areas and all kinds of places. But plantation products were primarily produced by enslaved laborers, and again, sugar is primarily produced by African enslaved laborers. I'll talk more about that. Okay, so this American wealth had huge effects on the rest of the world. So the influx of silver, especially to the old world, caused inflation. And the inflation caused social and political unrest all over the world, right? So in China, the Ottoman Empire, other parts of Asia, Europe, there was a lot of, there were a lot of economic problems and other kinds of problems. So this is one way to think about connections, right? We can think about global economic connections and the role of the Americas in the development of the early modern world. Another way to think about connections between the Americas and other parts of the world is to think about culture. So European contact with the people and lands of Latin America had profound global cultural effects. One of the primary arguments that Spaniards and other Europeans used to justify colonization in the Americas was the idea that they were spreading Christianity, or specifically Catholicism. Spanish and Portuguese monarchs got papal permission to exercise dominion over new lands for the purposes of Catholic conversion. So obviously the spread of Christianity was one, well, you could say cause, and also one cultural effect of colonization. Here we have a didactic image of friars in a 16th century Mexican monastery. This was meant to teach indigenous converts about the importance of evangelization. And here we have a church in Cusco, Peru, built over the remains of the Incan temple to the sun. So this was an Incan temple to the sun. You can see these amazing, bricks that make up this Incan wall. And then the temple was destroyed by the Spanish, and over it was built a church, which is now the Church of Santo Domingo. So these images then remind us that Catholicism had a huge impact in Latin America. But we also want to remember that contact with indigenous and African groups in the Americas also forced Catholics and other Christians to modify their own religious practices. So Christianity changed in the Americas, and really what we're talking about here is Catholicism. So for example, friars wrote prayer books in indigenous languages. So here we have Pedro de Gante, a friar, wrote it says, Comienza la doctrina cristiana en lengua mexicana, right? So he says, here's the Christian doctrine in the Mexican language. It's really the Nahuatl language, and the Nahua people are people of central Mexico, and Nahuatl is their language. So they translate prayer books into indigenous languages. They preach in indigenous languages. Pedro de Gante also made a catechism of pictures that were supposed to help people learn the prayers. And so in doing all these acts of translation, in many cases, friars actually ended up encoding native ideas in their teachings. So as they compared and translated Catholicism, as they compared Catholicism to native practices for the purposes of teaching, Christian ideas sometimes got lost in translation. So the famous Virgin of Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe, is an example of the way that Catholic ideas were interpreted and affected by indigenous and other people. So in 1531, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to an indigenous Mexican man in a place that's now in Mexico City that was sacred to Nahua people. So this was a place where before the contact, this had been a sacred place for Nahua people, this indigenous group in central Mexico. And so the Virgin of Guadalupe is seen as kind of representing this Nahua deity, maybe as well as the Virgin Mary. I mean, so of course, the Catholic missionaries of the 16th century did not see her this way, but it's possible that Nahua people saw her this way. She became more popular actually a little bit later in the colonial period. But anyway, she's seen as a virgin that has a lot of importance to indigenous people, and she's seen as a kind of syncretic or mixed figure in Mexico. The Virgin of Potosi, right, who we just saw here a few moments ago, may also be a representation of this kind of syncretic melding of indigenous and European ideas. So the mountain of Potosi had been the site of an important female Andean deity, Pachamama, before and after Spaniards forced the practice of Christianity. And some people say that this image may have represented the Andean deity to Andean viewers, rather than or in addition to representing a Christian image. Excuse me. So this is all just to say that cultural effects went both ways. Catholic colonizers destroyed native temples and built churches over them, and native people definitely adopted the practice of Christianity. But at the same time, indigenous people maintained their own religious practices and cultures and influenced Catholic ideas and cultures, right? So Catholicism and indigenous practices were compatible in the minds of indigenous thinkers. It wasn't necessarily either or, right? They're not compatible in the minds of Catholic missionaries, but for indigenous thinkers, for indigenous people, right, they could be compatible. And African and Christian practices were also not necessarily incompatible, and I'm going to return to this idea a little bit later. And so finally, another way to think about connections between the so-called New World of the Americas and the so-called Old World of Africa, Asia, and Europe is to think about demographic effects. So here we have a chart of the Columbian Exchange. The introduction of American crops like corn, legumes, and potatoes caused huge population growth in the rest of the world. So these are crops that grow really well in different climatic conditions. They're dry land crops. They need water, but they don't need as much water as, say, rice or something like that. So potential farmland all over the world increased with the introduction of these American crops. Food then increased and populations increased. So this is one demographic connection between the Americas and the rest of the world. In turn, as you can see here, European diseases had huge demographic effects in the Americas. So these European diseases killed millions of indigenous people. These were populations that had not been exposed to these European diseases before and did not have natural immunity, which this is like having more and more resonance for us, I think, today. But so these were incredibly deadly diseases. Oh, and then here we have an image, a 16th century indigenous produced image of what it was, of smallpox, of people suffering from smallpox. As new groups populated the Americas, primarily enslaved West and West Central Africans who arrived against their will, populations also changed, and Europeans and other immigrants also came and affected populations. But the majority of immigrants actually were Africans, enslaved Africans, in this early modern period or colonial period. So these are all things that, I mean, you probably already know, but I want to emphasize that these are ways that we can think about connections among and between the Americas and other parts of the world. And as I hope is obvious by the things I just said, I just want to emphasize that this is a two-way street. So for a long time, historians and other scholars emphasized the effects of colonization on the Americas. So they emphasize the idea that the old world acted on the new world and that the reverse was not true, right? It's all this acting upon the new world. So this idea that Europeans dominated the Americas in some kind of unproblematic way rests in part on an idea that American civilizations, and again, I mean indigenous or Native American civilizations, were inferior to European civilizations, right? Easily conquered. Some 19th century and early 20th century historians even claimed that Americans' lives were improved by colonization. And even those scholars who did not see colonization as an improvement on what came before characterized indigenous American cultures and people as hapless victims of European colonization. Okay, so it is certainly true that colonization brought a great deal of destruction in all ways. So like there's no, you're not getting any argument here about that. Like that is definitely true. But I also want to remind us that native cultures and people, and also transplanted African cultures and people were sophisticated and resilient, right? And my biggest point is that indigenous American cultures and people affected and changed old world people and cultures, including Europe and Europeans. So again, we want to look at the flow right in both directions. So to focus this discussion, I will now turn to commodities. Okay, so as you see on this picture or map, I guess, and as you read in the articles I gave you, many American commodities flowed to Europe beginning in the late 15th century, when Columbus first planted sugarcane and found people wearing gold ornaments in the Caribbean that really excited him. So just for today, I'm going to focus on sugar, which is not native to the Americas, pearls, cacao, tobacco, and then dyes, Brazil wood and cochineal, which you read about. And again, I hope that I am successful in emphasizing the way that American ideas, expertise, and technologies, as well as products or raw materials, affected the rest of the world. So I want to begin with sugar. Again, sugar is not native to the Americas, but it is a commodity that reveals the economic impact of American goods on a global scale. Okay, yeah, so this is where you can see the diffusion of sugar, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But as I said in the article I asked you to read, Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, which is a little tiny image here, so I couldn't get a bigger image. But Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power is a foundational book for discussing the rise of sugar and the connections between the Americas and Europe. And his book focuses really on the British sugar islands, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, and also on Britain. But sugar was, of course, central to Latin American economies as well, particularly Brazil and the Caribbean. So as you can see, sugar cultivation and consumption began probably in the Pacific and then made its way to India, through the Mediterranean, to Portuguese settlements on Atlantic islands off the African coast, and then to the Americas. And sugar was actually really grown all over Latin America, but especially in Brazil and in the Caribbean in this early modern period. And like the Spanish Caribbean, the French Caribbean, the British Caribbean, and the Dutch Caribbean were big sugar producing places. So the growing conditions in these areas were perfect for sugar production, which requires a tropical environment. And European colonization in the Americas coincided with the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And then, of course, this huge demand for sugar led to more demand for enslaved workers. So sugar sort of increased the slave trade as well. So sugar and slavery are inextricably linked. Like, you cannot think of them separately, particularly in this early modern period. One reason that planters relied on African enslaved labor was because sugar flourished in areas where indigenous populations had been heavily affected by disease, and also because sugar production was arduous. Sugar had to be planted, harvested, milled, and boiled in an unceasing cycle of labor. So we have the tending to the crops, right, planting, but then these people are, hoeing and weeding and pruning and harvesting, right? And you see these overseers here. This guy is beating, I think, this black laborer. Then there's the milling process, and there are different types of mills. This mill is being, as you can see, powered by these people, right? And they're feeding the cane through the cylinders in order to squeeze out the juice. And there was other kinds of mills as well. And then you see a different kind of water-powered mill. And then there's this boiling process as well on these in these sugar mills. So this was super dangerous work. Enslaved workers lost hands in the mills. They were burned in the boiling process. They died of overwork in hot fields. They were mistreated. I mean, you saw that person being beaten, right? They were made to work in incredibly difficult conditions. So mortality rates for enslaved workers were incredibly high in sugar regions. And this meant that new groups of enslaved people were constantly being imported from Africa. And so this is, again, this kind of cycle, right, of sugar and slavery. These maps, they're old, but they're good. They show, how the slave trade changed over time. So Europeans made money from sugar, a lot of money. So sugar was an incredibly valuable and super sought after product in Europe. So in the early modern period, sugar was super expensive. Most people couldn't afford it, and it signified wealth and sophistication for European elites. So American sugar production had effects both in the Americas and then elsewhere in Europe and other parts of the old world. American sugar had demographic and cultural effects. So in the Americas, enslaved African people brought their languages, their medical knowledge, their artistic styles, their agricultural expertise, and their religious practices. So here we have a candomblé, which is a religious group whose practices and whose deities, called orishas, are very similar to practices from West Africa, to this Yoruba region. And as I said before, when I was talking about the Virgin of Guadalupe, saints are also important parts of these candomblés. So orishas and saints, sort of their identities become melded together in a similar way that we saw when we talked about the Virgin of Potosi and the Virgin of Guadalupe. So Africans shaped Latin American cultures, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean, but really all over the Americas, right? Of course, including the United States, as we know. Sugar also had an economic effect on Europe and the rest of the world. So by the 18th century, it was super cheap, right? Due to mass production, by this, constantly increasing number of enslaved people. And money from sugar production helped finance the Industrial Revolution, which is arguably kind of, the beginning of the modern world, right? So money helped finance the Industrial Revolution, and sugar also fueled the bodies of the workers of the Industrial Revolution. So sugar arrived in mass quantities in Europe at the same time as coffee and tea, which were also colonial products. So sugar is cheap by this point, again, because it's being produced in big quantities. So coffee and tea, which were served with sugar, provided warmth, calories, and wakefulness for workers who were working long hours in factories. So these were not nutritious foods, but they were certainly convenience foods, right? And as you can see in the Industrial Revolution, often women and children were also doing the work. And so family life changed, right? And so again, this kind of convenience food and sugar food was sort of, a way to feed themselves in the absence of older, more traditional ways of producing food. So sugar is a good example of an American product that arguably helped give rise to the modern world, financing it and also affecting tastes everywhere. There's a lot of sugar today in the world. So pearls are another commodity that provide an example of an American product that impacted the early modern world. And they are the subject of a 2018 book by Molly Warsh. So like sugar, Europeans valued pearls before encountering the Americas. In fact, the Spanish monarchs specifically told Columbus to look for pearls. And he found them, right? Or colonizers found them. So pearls did in fact exist in the Caribbean and Caribbean islands, as well as coastal parts of Venezuela and other areas. So in these pearl areas, Spaniards forced enslaved indigenous and African laborers to dive for pearls. And this was famously deadly work. Divers were mistreated, they were bitten or killed by sharks, their lungs could be damaged by diving too deep. But pearls also provided opportunities. So they're small, they're smuggleable, right? Enslaved divers could hide them and smuggle them out of fisheries for themselves and sell them, on their own. So this is one way that pearls gave workers a little bit of leverage, right? And then the Spanish crown knew that these enslaved Black and indigenous divers were essential to the work of pearl collection, right? That their expertise was essential. So in the 16th century, the Spanish crown tried to lessen its reliance on these divers by trying to get people to build machines to harvest pearls. But in the end, they had to rely on the human divers. The machines did not work. I'm not sure they were even produced, really. In some cases, very productive divers were able to leverage their skill to demand better working conditions, more money, or a degree of autonomy. So this is, whoops, I'm doing the wrong thing. So this is, sort of one way that their pearl expertise they could sort of leverage in certain ways. Here we have Queen Elizabeth I wearing her pearl necklace, and we have this woman, this wealthy woman from New Spain or Mexico in the 18th century, and she has her little pearl decorations here, and I think here as well. So pearls, like sugar, were very lucrative commodities that brought the crown and entrepreneurs incredible wealth, and also, as you can see, pervaded elite culture, right, and signified status and other things. So pearls and sugar were not new to Europeans arriving in the Americas. but they provide examples of the way that the Americas affected old world economies and culture, right, and expressions of status. And pearls and sugar also give us an example of indigenous American and African descent work, labor, right, but also expertise. So they give us a way to think about not just labor, but also expertise. However, American technologies also affected the old world. And I think that cacao gives us a good way to start thinking about this. So cacao is the basis of chocolate. The term cacao refers to the seeds of the fruit of the cacao tree. So the seeds are, there's this kind of fleshy white coating. The seeds are then inside this coating. This whole thing is inside this pod, and then the pod grows from the tree. Cacao has been cultivated and consumed in Mesoamerica and parts of South America for millennia. Indigenous Americans from these regions really valued cacao, so it was a trade good. It kind of served as money as well as something that was consumed. Here are the cacao beans after processing, but after processing. So here we have a 1541 image that shows tribute that came from all over the Aztec Empire to the Emperor Moctezuma. As you can tell by the date, 1541, this was actually produced after the fall of the Aztec Empire, but it's a description of tribute items. And we see here the cacao was a very valuable tribute item. So this is just a detail of this, really. So here you see two sort of baskets or receptacles of cacao beans. It says, 100 or ciento cargas de cacao. So each of these little flags stands for like 100 units of cacao, and this symbolizes the basket of cacao. And then here we have these tecomates, these vessels that are used to drink cacao. Clay vessels used to drink cacao. So again, you see the value placed on cacao and its accompanying items. So Native Americans developed the technology, right, for cacao production or for chocolate production. So Native Americans fermented, dried, cooked, and ground these seeds in order to make a drink called cacahuat, right? And I wrote that here. Oops. And again, it's in this language Nahuatl, right, spoken by the Nahuatl people. So cacahuat. So when we're talking about chocolate in the early modern period, we're always talking about a drink, right? So there are these little tecomates that are used to drink. You drink the cacao from them. So chocolate, the food, appeared later. It appeared in the 19th century. So chocolate, the drink, and chocolate, the food, are both obviously incredibly important to European culture. So French drinking chocolate and Swiss and Belgian eating chocolate are really emblematic of those regions. So for a long time, historians talked about chocolate as something amazing that Europeans developed. Scholars and others acknowledged that the raw materials, the cacao, came from the Americas, right? So here's this, there we have it, the little cacao pod or cacao bean. It's this raw material that comes from the Americas. But this story was very much one of European innovation. So the idea was that Europeans took this raw material that was like good, but they made it awesome. They made it into all this stuff, right? All these delicious things. However, Marcy Norton, who I talked about in the article you read, has shown that, in fact, Europeans learned how to consume chocolate from Native Americans. It's about knowledge and technology. So first of all, Spaniards in the Americas did not automatically love chocolate. It's not like an innate taste. In fact, they thought it was kind of gross. So they had to learn to like it from the indigenous people who they saw drinking it. And second, Spaniards in the Americas and then Europeans in Europe learned how to consume chocolate from Native Americans as well. They learned the meanings of chocolate. They learned how to process it, but also they learned what it meant. So Mesoamericans and others had long ago figured out how to process these beans into cacahuat, right, into chocolate. you know, in the way that I just described. They also whisked it or poured it from great heights. As you can see, this woman is pouring this. This is actually the grinding, the mano, the grinding stone, right? And then this is this woman pouring it. And they poured it from great heights, or they used a molinillo to whip it in order to create foam. So that was the way that they drank it. And then these indigenous Mesoamericans also added flavorings like different kinds of flowers, different kinds of chilies, honey, you know, different kinds of flavorings. And so Europeans then learned how to make chocolate and how and when to drink it from indigenous people. So again, they learned how to process chocolate and, you know, make it into the drink. They learned to drink it with foam on top. So we don't froth it like this woman's doing, but we add whipped cream. And so that's a kind of, you know, holdover from this, something we learned, right? From these Mesoamericans. And Europeans learned to drink chocolate in social and celebratory situations, again, from indigenous people. The association of chocolate with Valentine's Day and with love probably comes from the Nahua idea that the pods were like a heart and the thick reddish liquid was like blood, and blood was a sacred element in Nahua or Aztec religion. Right, so the point is that it's not just the cacao pod, that it's not just that the cacao pod came from the Americas, right? The sort of more interesting or important point is that the way that chocolate was produced and the way that it was consumed and the meanings that were associated with it came from indigenous people, right? So this is indigenous American knowledge and technology that is being translated to Europe or sent to Europe. Tobacco, which Norton also writes about, was similar in many ways. Tobacco was cultivated and used in Mesoamerica and South America long before Europeans arrived. And native people smoked it and they chewed it. Initially, Europeans didn't like tobacco, but again, like they thought it was kind of gross. But they learned to smoke it in solemn occasions. They learned that this was something you smoked when you were meeting with indigenous leaders or when you were negotiating with indigenous leaders, right? So they adopted the meanings around it. And eventually tobacco became popular in Europe as well. So again, Europeans learned the agricultural and smoking technology from indigenous Americans. And Europeans also learned the meaning from these same people, right? They learned that smoking is a social thing or even a sacred thing. And they learned this from these indigenous Americans. Dyes were another very important agricultural product that brought wealth to European colonizers. So until the invention of synthetic dyes in the mid-19th century, all dyes came from plant and animal sources. And as you saw in the reading, these dyes were very much prized in Europe and Asia, especially red dyes, which were hard to create. I mean, they were like a secret in Europe. Nobody knew how to create them. They didn't have really good color fast sources of red. They didn't have really sort of vibrant sources of red. She talks about this in the article I gave you. Brazil is actually named for the bright red dye made from the wood of the Brazil tree. You can see here. This dye wood was one of the colony's chief exports in the 16th century. The Portuguese called these trees Brazil wood because the color looked like brajas, or embers, and they forced indigenous people, these Tupi people, to harvest it for them. And initially, there was a kind of negotiation, but it became forced labor, forced harvesting. And then you read about cochineal in the reading that I gave you. So cochineal is this vivid red dye made from crushed insects that live on a nopal cactus plant. People in Mesoamerica and Peru, or the Andes, or South America really, I guess, had used this red dye for millennia before the arrival of the Spanish. And again, this was an American technology. So indigenous cultivators planted the nopales, the paddles of these cacti. They bred the cochineal insects, selecting for desirable qualities like the red. They placed the insects on the cacti, and these indigenous cultivators then had to protect both the insects and the plants from, predators, cold, too much water, too little water, this kind of thing. They had to tend to them. They harvested the insects, they cleaned them, they either boiled or dried them, or they baked them. They ground them into a powdered dye, which they then formed into bricks or loaves for transport to market, local or eventually global markets. So cochineal was used for paintings and textiles in Europe and also in Asia, in the Ottoman Empire, China, Japan, and other parts of Asia, beginning in the 16th century. So as the reading said, red was the color of status. It was expensive, and having it meant that you were wealthy and important. And so here's this painting, this 17th century Murillo painting. And you can see here is the Virgin Mary, and she's wearing this red, the red of her cloak, signifies her importance in this image. And so cochineal was especially really good for Spain because they controlled the source of this dye. So it brought a lot of money to Spain. So emeralds, timber, gold, copper, many food items were also exported to Europe, Asia, and Africa from the Americas. And it created a great deal of wealth for the people who were in charge of the trade, and also for the crowns, for the monarchs who took a cut of the profits. All of these goods, these American goods, changed global economies, populations, and cultures. And of course, African and indigenous labor made it all possible. And this story is not particularly new, right? But what I don't know if it's new, but it's maybe interesting, right? The point that I want to make here is that indigenous American, right, and African American technologies were also exported to Europe. So colonialism is a story, of course, of domination and colonialism. Of domination and exploitation. Colonialism is a story of domination and exploitation. It can also be sometimes a story of negotiation. But we really have to see, or I think it's important to see the way that influence, knowledge, and technology went both ways across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, really. So indigenous and Black Americans influenced Europeans and others through the very items that Europeans desired so much and prized so highly. Indigenous and Black Americans developed the processes, the meanings, and the bodily practices that went along with these desired goods. So the point I want to leave you with is this. As old world people ingested food or drug items, or as they used, other kinds of items, often to adorn their bodies, they also incorporated new world skills, technologies, and ideas into their own bodies and into their own ideologies. And I think this is a useful way to think about the connections between Latin America or the Americas and the rest of the world in this early modern period. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope that you have gotten something out of this. Thank you.
So again, I will introduce Professor Bristol to entertain your questions about her lecture.
Is Jean?
Yes, hello, good morning. It's Jean Trabolsi. Dr. Bristol, it was a complete privilege to listen to your lecture.
Oh, thank you.
I love the slides. I love the coherent flow of your logic.
Thank you.
It was very easy to understand.
I'm very glad. Thank you. Even with the top of my head missing, I was looking at the...
I was not looking at you, I'm afraid. I was
Good. Well,
looking
that
at
makes me
slides,
very happy.
especially your slides of the processes of how they actually make these commodities like sugar.
Mhm.
I had no idea it was so tough,
Oh,
so
wow.
labor intensive.
Hmm.
I the concept of, I understood how the ideas of one culture infuse the ideas of another culture, but I never thought about it in the sense of when an Englishman has a cup of tea and puts sugar in it,
Hmm.
that sugar goes in his body and transforms him. I mean, I never thought about it as being that intimate,
Yeah.
that you would change physically.
Yeah.
That the tea and sugar gave you wakefulness, it gave you warmth, it gave you the ability to work long hours in the industrial mills. I mean, all of this was very welcome knowledge to me.
Oh, I'm glad.
I have a question about beet sugar. My husband is from Europe. They
Mhm.
only used sugar from beets, not from sugar cane.
Yeah.
How does beet sugar come into this?
That's a good question. I am not actually sure. So as I think, as I said in the talk, I get most of my information from Sydney Mintz's book, 1986 book, Sweetness and Power. And so maybe if any of you have read that, you could also help me answer this question. I mean, I think they did not. So I know that before Europeans began importing sugarcane from, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, they sweetened things with honey or with fruit juices and that kind of thing. So I know that beet sugar was not used before cane sugar, or I'm pretty sure of that, but I don't actually know when it was introduced. I'm sorry to say. I mean, does anybody else know? I imagine many of you know things too about this sort of thing.
I believe that beet sugar came in much later. It might even be a 20th century innovation that they would have bred them. They would have bred the sugar beets to produce high levels of sugar, and I do believe that's a 20th century. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Uh-huh.
Please correct me if you know otherwise, but definitely it was an import substitution issue.
Uh-huh. Oh, okay, interesting. All right. Oh, that's interesting. All right, yeah. Okay, good question. Oh, Therese says that Julia Child said that beet sugar and cane. Yes, I think that that's true. Sydney Mintz also says that they don't taste or act differently. That's a really good point also.
My husband used to buy it in the shells and big, it looks like regular sugar. It's
Uh-huh.
completely white and granulated. It looks just like cane sugar.
Yeah, I think a lot of the sugar that we get, like if we go to the supermarket and buy sugar, I'm not I guess sometimes it's labeled cane sugar, but I think sometimes you don't know. I mean, I don't think it's a problem really,
No.
but I'm not sure you necessarily know where it came from, I guess, unless it says cane sugar. And then Carna Cruz says, yeah, that makes sense also given what you guys are saying, used during World War II due to rationing. And maybe that's about the European, maybe that's why in Europe also. So good points.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Nicole Willard.
Hi. I've known about the sugar and sweetness in Mintz's book, and I've read it a while ago, and I actually learned a few things from your lecture that I didn't know about before, how the processes were different. They weren't standardized.
Uh-huh.
So I thought that was interesting. And one thing I didn't know about that was very fascinating was the pearl divers. So I wonder, I guess I always assumed that that originated in Southeast Asia. How did they know? I mean, I guess I want to know a little bit more about that because that's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So were they aware of the pearls there, and were the natives already getting the pearls, or were the Europeans demanding them to get the pearls?
That is a good question. I am not sure about that. I mean, I think it was something, I mean, it definitely was something that existed. And I think that they did have, it was a long time since I've read this book, the Molly Warsh book that I sent you to. But it definitely is something that ramps up with Europeans. But in terms of the actual technologies of pearl diving, whether that's something that existed at the time, I mean, that existed before Europeans arrived or Europeans brought it. I mean, I think it existed before Europeans arrived, but I have to be honest, I'm not exactly sure. So again, really good question. And also is like a good question sort of given the overall thesis of my lecture, but I'm not really sure about that.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
On the Indian Ocean and World History, there's a section on pearl diving in the Persian/Arabian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do a search on indianoceanhistory.org, and you will find that link.
I mean, it's certainly something that had value before. I mean, but Nicole, I think you were saying this also, right? It's like, it's something that had value before. And so Europeans, much like gold and silver and other sort of precious things, they were excited to learn that they had access to those things in the Caribbean and in Venezuela. So it's not that it's not that the associations came from the Americas, but in terms of the technology, that's a really good question. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I think it's worldwide. I mean, they had been doing it in Japan, but it's so dangerous, people doing this without the help of oxygen or anything. Jennifer has the next question. Jennifer Cross.
Hi. I actually I have the stuff that you talked about with the sugar and even with the cocoa I had learned about, but the red dye was really fascinating to me. And so I just sort of like, as I was reading, both listening to your lecture and doing the reading, it hit me as sort of a comparison to the Chinese control of the silk, sort of like the way silk was made, and that the way that sort of protectionism of that process in order to make sure that they had control of the market. And so you mentioned something, I think it was in your lecture, where you mentioned that there was a real effort to control that red dye. So my curiosity was it because of the marketing of it, or was it also or more controlling as far as, I don't know how to say it, like a societal structure, since those colors showed status and importance?
Oh, I understand what you're saying. I think more the former. So it was very expensive. So I think that's how that's why it ends up being limited to wealthy people or important people. I mean, it's possible that in places that are not Iberia, which again, you may know more about than I, there were sumptuary laws that controlled who got to use I mean, I know that, red is associated with cardinals or with emperors or this kind of thing. But I think in Iberia, at least, and in the Iberian Americas, it was really just that it was expensive. So that sort of limited who had access to that color. And then in terms of like the sort of mercantile control, it was produced really in Mesoamerica. Mm-hmm. And so the Iberian crown held a monopoly on that production. And in fact, it was produced by indigenous people, by Nahua people, the Nahua people of central Mexico, and then other people. And a lot of them actually made some, money off of that also by selling it to crown agents and that kind of thing. But so I was talking more about that former kind of control that you were talking about, the kind of mercantile control. Although, again, I'm sure that in some places there are sumptuary laws controlling it. And again, you guys may know more than I about like Italy or other places like that.
Well, the other thing I wanted to just mention, because you had, I think it was in the reading that you talked about, like just the reduction of the labor force to help with that production of, because they did know the processes of how to sort of like, I don't want to call harvest, but to grow the insects. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So they knew the process. That was something the natives had, and so that I thought that was really interesting. That point of as the European impact on the population itself reduced the natives who had that knowledge. It meant that there was less product, which made it more expensive. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. There's sort of the flip side of that, I guess, is like in my own teaching, there's a great primary source where the elite, so one of the places that cochineal was produced is this place called Tlaxcala, which I don't know, like it's a state in Mexico now, you guys may know it, but a place called Tlaxcala, and that was a place of production of cochineal. And there's I translated into English, but there's the like minutes of the town council, and the town council is complaining about all the terrible effects of cochineal production on the people in Tlaxcala. And so they're Nahua native leaders talking about the terrible effects of cochineal production on the native people of the town. But it really, what the effects that the elite leaders are worried about is that it's messing up the social structure, because now like anybody can get money from cochineal. And so you, as you realize it, as you sort of read it more and more, you realize that they're upset because I mean, it's like a nice thing for students because it's not about the Spanish at all. I mean, it is sort of about the market and that kind of thing, but you know, it's like two groups of native people writing to the Spanish. But anyway, and so they're upset because like they say things like, well, now just any old person has enough money from cochineal to buy cacao, and they waste it and they pour it on the ground, and they're drinking a lot, and they're sort of, I mean, the subtext is, you know, they don't realize that there are subjects and that they should be respecting us and this kind of thing. So that's not really, I mean, it's not exactly related to what you're talking about. I mean, it's not related to what you're talking about at all, I should say, because you're talking about supply and population stuff, but it's another way of thinking about the effects on the population that is maybe a different way of thinking about it than the sort of like, I just was watching part of Crystal Bartolovich's lecture. So she was talking about travel and travail, you know, so and she was talking about agency and people being co-agents. And so that's another way of sort of thinking about the effects on the native population and the effects of the native population on the supply without necessarily focusing on demographic reduction, which of course, as you say, Jennifer, is also part of the story, but it's sort of another flip side to thinking about it. So, but yeah, so it affected the supply, you know, and the way it was used and that kind of thing.
Yeah, an interesting idea for the classroom would be thinking about, you know, these colors. Like back in the classical period, it was the royal purple that was restricted, and so now we have this other, you know, red that's restricted for a different reason. There's a whole set of things, of materials on power dressing that one could do.
Well, Karima Alavi here says these Italian sumptuary laws were meant to keep the masses from wearing red and black, right? So, so those sorts of ideas.
Fascinating. So what was black made of, Karima?
Karima?
Okay, I needed to unmute myself.
Yeah, there's always that lag.
It was primarily different roots that they used for the black. And one of the roots they used actually was madder, which was a Persian root, a root of a Persian plant, because they knew that would turn to brown eventually. And if you mix brown and red, you end up with a blackish stain.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And they also, Karima, didn't they also, before cochineal and these other, and like Brazil wood and that kind of thing, I think that madder was one of the ingredients that they somewhat successfully used to make reds, also, or tried to use to make reds.
Yeah. That was the only one that made a red that they liked but then that's the one that faded to brown. So I also put a little note in there in the chats that even the British redcoats used cochineal for the dye for the officers, but the rest of the schmucks used madder.
So what's vermilion
it was so
then?
status, you know, the status was. Good question. Isn't that a plant?
I'm checking
Vermilion?
that out right now.
Yeah, I think it's a plant.
Both brilliant and red or scarlet pigment, originally made from powdered mineral cinnabar and the corresponding color. So
okay. Well, one of the really funny things, and then I'll get out of the way here, is in Italy, one of the families, can't remember their name, it started with an R, one of the big families in Florence, they had a monopoly on red, and they said that they got it by mixing urine and lichen from a specific tree. And that one of their, you know, the legend, I suppose, is that one of their ancestors went over to a tree and peed and noticed that the lichen turned into this brilliant red. And so they were actually becoming extremely wealthy by keeping this secret and then mixing human urine with that lichen.
I can't resist mentioning this then, because in the Mughal painting, there's a film video that Unity Productions Foundation did. It's called Islamic Art Mirror of the Invisible World. And the art historian mentions that this brilliant yellow in the Mughal miniature painting was made by feeding cows mangoes and using their urine. So,
yeah, that's in my novel. I have the guy who's looking for the colors for Michelangelo, because that's one of the things he used was what I called cow piss yellow.
Right.
And it's a real thing.
apparently urine is a very powerful chemical. So
Yeah, Therese Treblock says that it's a difixative, so that the
Yeah.
diverse,
Makes sense.
yeah, with ammonia in it.
But like Renee Johnson says, cochineal is still used as a food dye, and I think, I don't know if it says it in the article that you looked at or if you looked at it, but yeah, you can see cochineal in a lot of ingredient lists of food.
And lipstick.
Yeah, although somebody else said it's not in vegan. I guess it's not in vegan.
Yeah,
meat.
put bugs on your lips, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Dead bugs on your
really.
Okay, we have several questions. Kelly Anderson had a question.
Yes, hi. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm hoping to use parts of it with my students this year. The part that I thought, I teach an AP Euro class, and the part that I thought would be most illuminating for them that I really liked your perspective on was the part where you talked about emphasizing the knowledge and technology transfer from the New World as opposed to just raw materials, because I believe that's how it's taught in most schools I've been or seen. So I loved that perspective. I was wondering if you could expand, can you expand any more on ideas about other technologies or knowledges that were transferred that you can think of? Because I'd love to do a little unit on that for my kids.
Well, I guess okay. So I also was watching Professor, the guy yesterday, Joel, what's his name, and so I only watched part of each of those. So, but I liked how he was talking also about the export of knowledge and epistemology and that kind of thing. Well, I think, I talked, you guys have probably thought about this too, but I talked a little bit about this, I guess, but certainly you can think about religion and religious practice. I think I showed you Pedro de Gante's little stuff. Like, people talk a lot about how, ideas about native practices actually affected Christianity and changed Christianity. So that is always a good one to think about. Although, the other thing is, this is sort of making me, like, I really do focus on Latin America. So I know more about changes in Spanish culture in Latin America. And I sort of borrowed this idea about changes elsewhere, from Marcy Norton's book. But so I think you can think about, so you can think about religion. Also, in some places, native languages replaced, some places in the Americas, native languages actually replaced or coexisted, I guess, with Spanish. So like in Yucatan, people who are identified as Spanish would sometimes be speaking Yucatec Maya, at least as another first language. I don't think it's like they stopped speaking Spanish, but they would also, like Yucatec Maya became kind of a lingua franca in the region of Yucatan. So I think that those are some ways of thinking about that. Like, I would think about, I guess, religion or culture. I also showed you those candomblés, in Brazil, which again, I'm sure many of you know a lot about, but, that's also a way of thinking about the way that religious practice, certainly in the Americas, is changed. And then, probably in other places as well. So those might be ways of thinking about it.
Great, thank you. I really appreciated that perspective, and I think it'll really help my kids. So thank you.
Well, your point about, it's not just like objects that are made and then remade in some extra special way, so it's like, I think your point is good. That I also sort of said, but like the idea that it's not just about objects, it's about technology, and it's about, technologies that actually have huge impact in these other places, or epistemologies. So
yeah, exactly. And my kids are fairly young, so they still have this like sort of hierarchy of knowledge idea. So I think it'll help them a lot as far as assigning value. Thank you.
And tomorrow we have Pamela Smith from the Making and Knowing Project about how those things were the materials collected from all over the world, and the technologies were put together. It's this fascinating project at Columbia. So we have now Maureen McCarthy.
Hi, I had basically the same question as Kelly. But another question I had, you didn't really use the term Columbian exchange that much, and I was wondering if that was on purpose, and if that was a kind of new way of looking at this.
Not really. I was thinking about, so I have two kids in middle school and a kid in high school. And so I was like asking them what they've learned, because I kind of felt like everything I was saying is probably stuff you already knew. So I was trying to like run it by them. And one of my kids said, oh, teachers love the Columbian exchange, which like I totally get, because I love the Columbian exchange, or I love talking about it that way. But I was sort of conscious of the fact that I wasn't really talking about it as the Columbian exchange. And I think part of it is, that I just wanted to emphasize the actual processes. And then I think also, like, I mean, I'm sure you guys say this too, but Columbian exchange makes it kind of really linked to Columbus in all kinds of ways. And of course, again, I'm sure that you say this to your students as well, but I always say to them, well, it's just kind of short, my own students, I mean, not my children, although maybe I should say it to them too, but you know, this is like a shorthand. It's just Columbus is like this way that we use to periodize this area. And it's just a way of saying before and after, but it links a lot of responsibility to Columbus. So I think, I mean, I don't think I really thought about it that much in my head, but I think that that might be why I'm sort of, so I'm, and I don't know if really other people are talking about this, but I think that might also be a reason why, because, you know, we're trying to decenter Columbus and do all these things, and then we're calling it the Columbian Exchange. And it's not like the Columbian Exchange was so great in a lot of ways, but it does make, it's just another way of making Columbus really important in a way that we're trying not to anyway, you know. Right. So I think I might, so it's a really good point. I think that might be why.
And another aspect of the Columbian Exchange is that it's often sort of seen to see how did it affect Europe, when in fact we know now that the global effect of the Columbian Exchange, within a century, the population in China had increased enormously because of the potato. And right. There's a lot of interesting work by that, among them the journalist Charles Mann, who wrote both 1491 and 1493 and has some interesting talks on that subject about China, but also of course its effect on Africa. And then the pre-Columbian Exchange, how did all that stuff get to Iberia, which was the point of that other exhibit. So it's decentering Europe and Columbus is an important part of
yeah, that's a really good point. Students. And then also, I guess, there's the idea that like it wasn't really about 1492. It's like something didn't change until the 19th century or something. And so it's important in that way too.
And tomatoes were poisonous. They're purple, you know, they're nightshade plants. Okay, the next one we have is Nejla Druby.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. It was really very interesting. And the best part is thinking beyond the immediate product and the immediate use of the product. So for example, how having sugar in coffee and tea speeded up the industrialization. I think that whole chain was very interesting. I had questions regarding smoking. You said the Europeans smoke before all of this, or was it all introduced from America? Okay, yeah. So in a way, I feel like, okay, what goes around comes around. We gave them all these diseases and they gave us this that keeps killing us now over and over.
Right.
But was it harmful? Was their smoking harmful, or was it a healthier one than what we have?
I think it was the same. They smoked in these little clay tubes and sort of pipe-like things. They also used it as snuff, and they used it as, I mean, native people used it as poultices and stuff, but it's the same technology. I mean, it's using different materials, but it's the same.
Okay, the question I have really is about the pearls. In the Middle East, they use mother of pearl to make lots of furniture and whatever. So how much of that also made it all the way through to the Middle East?
Oh, American pearls?
Is it did they only export the pearls, or did they export also the
uses?
No, the shell that contained the pearl, because it's the lining of that shell that is used for the mother of pearl furniture. And did the Europeans benefit from that sale, or was it also demanded?
That's a really good question. I think it was just the pearls, but I really don't know. That's a very good question.
Okay, and would the Europeans have benefited from that, or was it also where the pearls and the mother of pearl being commissioned by the Middle East, by people, by the Ottoman Empire and all the other stuff?
I think it was just the pearls. But so this is now a tangent, but also interesting. Emeralds, you know, were not a major product, but the emeralds were exported from what's now Colombia, basically. And those, I think like there's the Topkapi dagger in Turkey, and some Mughal jewels and also other things. Those emeralds from Colombia, I think it's true. I mean, I think it has been ascertained that those are Colombian, or maybe not actually. But okay, so forget about the Topkapi dagger and those, but those emeralds from Colombia were actually brought to the Middle East and used in India and Turkey and Iran. But the provenance was unacknowledged because people, there was this idea that, I'm thinking, I don't know, Susan, if you've read this book or other people have, I'm thinking of this book by Chris Lane, who, it's a good book. It's called The Color of Paradise. And so he talks about how there was this idea that like Asian emeralds were good and or American emeralds or Colombian emeralds were crap. But actually that's just this idea. Actually, they're not, you know, they're good also and very similar, but they end up being used in Asian products, you know, Asian writ large, but it's never acknowledged that these are actually American emeralds. So I don't know if that's, so really I can't, the mother of pearl I do not think was exported, but it's another way of thinking. I mean, there's a good point that you're making, and it's another way of thinking about that, like both the way that American value is seen as lesser than Asian value, but the way that but the way that, and this is like about the question that I think Nicole asked about the pearls, you know, emeralds were valued in the Middle East and in Asia. And so the emeralds that came from Colombia sort of slotted into that like system of value that already existed. So there's like multiple things. So it's like just a different example. It's not really about the pearls at all, but it relates to, I think, what you're saying.
That might have been, you know,
my
trying to
question,
protect also their own markets.
Right, for sure, yeah.
but my
Go
question
ahead.
really is how much the Middle East contribute to the development also of slavery to get the mother of pearl, or was it something that was being bought by the Europeans and then resold over, and that benefited even the Europeans?
I mean, I'm not sure necessarily that so pearls and then also emeralds, which is what I just introduced into your question was not about emeralds, but pearls were also came from other regions. So I think it was the same kind of thing that they slot into a system of value that already exists, but that it's a resource that's controlled by Iberians that allow them, you know, give them sort of more power on the market, I guess, or something like that. But I don't think, I just don't know enough about pearls really, but I don't think necessarily that it affects the way that they are used or seen in these other areas. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Linda Burns.
This goes back to that great discussion you had about the about the conversation about the elites saying that the Cochinella production was screwing up the social. I'm just wondering if you know if we could access that source, where we could access that.
Okay, so because I assign this, I love this. I assign this every time I teach the survey.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. I want to assign it, so I want to know where to get it.
It's in this book, which is just like a reader. It's just a reader that I use in my class. So, you know, I don't know about like copyright. I mean, I don't know if it exists somewhere on the internet or whatever. Like, I mean, I could.
That's all right.
For you.
I can always get, that would be awesome. But I can also get the book.
Am I allowed to do that? Like, that's the thing. Like, if I'm not doing anything, like I'm not allowed to do, I could.
Fair use.
Okay.
We're teachers. We're not making money off of this stuff.
Okay. Should I scan it? And
sure. Yeah, great.
That would be fabulous. Thank you so much.
Susan.
Great. Yep.
Okay.
And I'll post it in the box under today.
Okay, cool.
And then I just had that was why I had raised my hand, but then as this discussion's been going on, it's been wonderful. I had another question or comment that maybe is a question about the Columbian exchange that I love the discussion about the idea that calling it Columbian is, you know, problematic because we're trying to decenter Columbus. And I'm wondering what you think about the idea of calling it an exchange as somewhat problematic also, only because some things that are included in there are well, first of all, many of the things that are extracted through slave labor. So exchange implies like a mutual, let's get together and talk about what we have. And that's not really an accurate depiction. And then also because disease is often included in that, which doesn't feel like an intentional exchange or especially since it was so decimating. So I don't know.
Well,
what you think about that.
People were saying here, I mean, that's like interesting to think about what you guys think about. Somebody said, is there something else to call it? But yeah, the idea, I mean, so I think the reason probably that the idea of exchange is used or what began to be used whenever people first started talking about this.
It's Crosby, right? That came up with it.
Did Crosby actually come up with that term?
I thought so.
I think so, yeah.
I mean, the book is called Columbian Exchange. So yeah, that makes sense. So my guess is because it was a way of saying that that the Americas sent stuff out, that it wasn't just a receiver of everything, right? So I think probably the reason that we talk about it as an exchange is to emphasize that point, right? Even though it doesn't get emphasized as much as we're emphasizing now in this conversation about epistemology and that kind of thing. But that's a good question. I mean, is there something better to call it? Because you're right, it does kind of glaze over a lot of violence, because this is, I mean, obviously it's colonialism, like it's an incredibly violent process, right?
I mean, the things that are transferred are extracted. They're not, including the people, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah. So,
and some of them run rampant, and Crosby talks about how the, you know, cattle and pigs, you know, just ran rampant and altered the environment. So, yeah.
Well, because like in that Crystal Bartolovich, which I think she's also today, she was talking, I mean, again, I did not finish watching her video, but she was talking about she was talking about critiques of the way, like she began the conversation saying people are co-agents in making their world, right? But then she was talking about critiques of that kind of agency. And so I think the idea of exchange comes from this attempt to emphasize this point, right? That the Americas are part of this process, but then like you're saying, it's problematic because it papers over some things. So I don't know if like in the chat, people have better ways of thinking. Oh, somebody says, oh yeah, so that's a really good point. Celeste Dekai says, you know, it's really hard to, I mean, whatever, like you guys know this because we're all engaged in the same project, but it's just hard to figure out how to periodize, what to call it. So yeah, I always end up saying, well, I mean, again, I'm sure you guys do this too, but that what I do is I write stuff on the board and I say, what does it mean? Why do we call it this? What are the problems with it? You know, so like you blow up the whole thing and then you just end up using the kind of same old Eurocentric categories that you always used.
Yeah,
so
but it's good to have the conversation. I mean, I think that's
right.
More.
Exactly. And that's a really smart comment too that you made. Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's really good.
I can't resist mentioning when the national standards for US history were first put out, the very first unit the rubric is called 3 Worlds Meet. And believe it or not, there was an uproar over this from certain folk of the right wing, including the then head of NEH named Lynn Cheney. Yes, that Lynn Cheney.
Yes.
And who wanted to disavow it because they're like, how can you put those 3 in at the same level?
Yeah, you know? Because Asia was way more important than Europe, right? I'm sure that's what she was saying.
Well, yeah, maybe. But I mean, that was one of the reasons to excoriate the US history standards when they came out in 1995. But, you know, because it showed this agency from all the sides and didn't even mention, of course, Asia. But yeah, they meant Europe and African Americans. Of course, the skills that African slaves brought to rice cultivation and cotton cultivation and those kinds of things. Okay, well, we have Roshni, who is next up with her hand raised. If anybody else wants to raise your hand? Yes, good morning.
Okay. Good. So good morning. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us. I read your essay and there were some parts of it that stuck out as just a phenomenal way of expressing your ideas. So I had a question about where you're talking about Cuba. It says products can define a country or a culture, basically, and tobacco and sugar define the pre-Castro Cuba. You mentioned that Ortiz characterizes Cuba as an indigenous product, individualistic, dark, male, bitter, and then sugar is the import, capitalistic, white, female, and sweet. And I just thought that was such a vivid description for you to include that into your essay. But do you know of other locations in the Americas or elsewhere where they are specifically defined by the products? You know, we know very little about, generally speaking, very little about Cuba other than the products and the melding of Catholicism with indigenous culture. So do you have any other locations where products are really what identifies those areas?
Well, I guess it depends. I mean, well, so first of all, that Ortiz thing is interesting that you bring that up. That's a good thing to bring up because that's like kind of really problematic, right? Like that book was written, I think, in the 40s. And so he's kind of it's sort of very gendered in a deeply problematic way, right? And he's kind of using the association of Cuba with these commodities for his own sort of sense of national pride and that kind of thing, as you said, Rashna, I think is your name, in the pre-Castro, right? So, but I guess, I mean, like, I think that people think about the Middle East in terms of oil, you know? I don't think they talk about, you know, do you know what Mexico's largest export is? It's oil. But they do not talk about Mexico. Nobody thinks about Mexico and oil, right?
Right.
Certainly the Middle East, I think, tends to be identified with oil in the U.S. imagination anyway, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think that Brazil, I mean, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but like, I mean, I think Brazil is often associated with sugar, at least in the more modern period. Virginia is often associated with tobacco in the kind of, you know, 19th century way of thinking about things. So, and it's a smart, like, I mean, your point is a really good one because it's about an internal sense of identity and an external sense of identity, right? And so Ortiz is kind of using it as a way of expressing a kind of national identity, but of course it's also identifying nations with products is also a way of
like an imposed identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I guess that's where my question really stems from. We meaning the group of people who write history, we aren't the indigenous people who lived in the Americas. And so, you know, how do we label these countries or territories or regions based on products? And I haven't really seen, other than this example of Cuba, I haven't really seen someone say, oh, well, you know, Brazil is only known for this, or Peru is only known for that. And that's why I was just wondering if you came across other examples like that.
Not necessarily scholarly. And I think Ortiz, I mean, I think that really is a sort of product of a certain place and time and sensibility, you know.
Okay.
So I think that, and I think he's also sort of complaining about it in a way, sort of, there's both of those things happening. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed reading your essay and listening to your talk. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great. We have a question in chat from Rochelle Hijazi. She says, I'd like to know more about the Potosi and the silver trade, how it disrupted the economy. I think she means the global economy, and whether that was a purposeful decision by the Spaniards, or did they not really understand economics, or were they never affected and it was just the Chinese economy?
Well, I mean, so the silver, silver totally messed up Spain's economy in a big way. I mean, because of certain choices that were made in Spain, right? But so yeah, so they get all this silver. They get a lot from Potosi, but there are other silver mines in the Andes and in Mexico as well. But it's this big, I mean, whatever, I talk about it. But yeah, so there's all this silver flowing into Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries at the same time that Philip II is like using all this money to fight all these wars, right? So he's fighting against Muslim forces in the Mediterranean, and he's fighting against the Reformation. So he's sending troops to fight in the French wars of religion. And so Philip II is kind of, well, I guess two things. It's sort of using the money from the silver that comes in, almost as soon as it comes in, it goes out, right? Because he's spending it in all these ways. And then also Spain does not really develop much of an industrial base. I mean, it still doesn't have much of an industrial base, I think. And so so Spain ends up relying on its raw materials to use to buy manufactured goods from like textiles from the Low Countries, or later on, sometimes leather goods or like watches and things like that from Great Britain, and then especially during the Industrial Revolution. So the silver sort of flies through Spain. Spain ends up going into terrible debt. I mean, it's really kind of the end of the golden age of Spain, right? So Spain is in a terrible financial situation after that. And as you said, Rochelle, then it causes, this tremendous influx of silver into the world economy causes inflation in Asia and in Europe and in all these places. And then there's this economic depression and that kind of thing. So it was not a conscious choice, and they didn't do a really good job. Spain does not come out of this very well. So it did disrupt the Spanish economy, and it was not a conscious decision. It kind of screwed them over. They screwed themselves over.
Might that not have been the first sort of wave, repercussions of what happens to currency in the global economy? I mean, that would have been maybe the first hit that I think what Rochelle mentioned, that what did they just not know? I think that was the first wake-up call.
Yeah.
And, leading to some of these theories, maybe thinking how to counter it, what to do.
Yeah, but we don't understand the economy now. I mean, it's like,
no, that's also true.
It means exactly what we see today. It's like we're always making these short-term, you know what I mean? It's like exactly that. It was like short-term gains for long-term losses. I mean, I think you're right though, Susan. There weren't these models before. Yeah.
Right. But now the new problems keep emerging, and we try to catch up with them, the economists. Okay, that was a great discussion, and the chat is fabulous. There's all sorts of things. Someone mentioned uploading a lesson plan. Don't forget that I put in the syllabus yesterday, I added a Google folder that everybody can upload to. So any of these links, just toss them in there, or any other documents. This is like, I'm going to save this chat and maybe upload it there, but it was a really terrific chat, which is, we thanks to Joan for your very stimulating article and work. I really did want to include this in the Renaissance because I think it's an important part of really, decentering this narrow idea of the Renaissance and bringing in the rest of the world, because those things were there. We see them in the paintings. That's why the idea of doing geo art with some of those very detailed, realistic paintings of the period, the genre paintings, because they just absolutely scream what was going on in global trade, and then being able to map those items that are in there. So thank you so much for taking part here.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I'll scan that thing and send it to Susan now.
Okay, terrific. All right.